Good morning. I'm Jack Teeb, CMHC Chief of Psychology, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the annual Dr. Sidney J. Blatt Lectureship in the Department of Psychiatry. The Blatt Lectureship was established in 2016 by David and Lisa Blatt as an endowment living in perpetuity in the Department of Psychiatry as a tribute to Dr. Blatt, who served as chief of the psychology section in the department for 50 years. Today we are honored to have members of Dr. Blatt's family with us, his son David and daughter-in-law Lisa, and his daughter Susan, and his son-in-law Charlie. I'd like to thank each of you for being with us here today. Today we have a brief program to honor Dr. Blatt's legacy in the department before hearing from our speaker, Dr. Drew Westen. First, Dr. Kay Long will offer a few remarks about Dr. Blatt as scholar, leader, and mentor, which will include a presentation of the Sidney J. Blatt Memorial Lectureship plaque to Dr. Westen by his son David. Next, Dr. Matthew Steinfeld will introduce Dr. Westen, followed by Dr. Westen's presentation. Okay.
So, can you hear me? Can everyone? Yeah. I've been asked to say a few words about the legacy of the man we're here to honor today. Sid's groundbreaking work in the areas of object relations, internalization, representation, depression, and his original theory of two personality configurations involving relatedness and self-definition continue to inform and inspire scholarly research around the globe, even now, 5 years after his death. Using a database called Web of Science and searching only the exact name of Blatt, SJ, a research librarian at Sterling Library that I contacted this week found 9,662 lifetime citations and 2,465 citations since he died in 2014. These statistics suggest the lasting impact of Sid's work and that his influence is in fact growing. As another measure of his influence, in the past 5 years, 4 major journals have published special issues in Sid's honor: the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, the Journal of Personality Assessment, Psychoanalytic Psychology, and Psychoanalytic Inquiry. But what these measures fail to capture is the impact of Sid's investment in the intellectual development of scores of students and mentees over decades and around the world. Sid Blatt was my teacher, my mentor, and my friend for more than 30 years. He was the person I turned to when I was stumped trying to interpret a Rorschach, when I felt puzzled by a difficult clinical situation, or when I was trying to think through a thorny theoretical issue. When Sid took you under his wing, he had a way of letting you know he believed in you, that he could see something you often couldn't see in yourself. Honestly, it could be a little intimidating. But I think many of us felt that in trying to live up to his regard, we were able to develop professionally more than we had thought possible. I can only hope that I'm passing on some small measure of Sid's intellect and heart as I teach my students and work with my patients. I'd like now to ask Sid's son, David Blatt, to join me up on the podium to present Dr. Westen with this year's Dr. Sidney J. Blatt Memorial Award.
Dr. Westen, thank you so much for coming here today. I can tell by just looking at your cover slide that you're a particularly appropriate speaker for my dad's lectureship because while he was a psychologist and a psychoanalyst by day, by night he was a true political junkie. And so I think you share a great deal, not just with your vocational interest, but your extracurricular interests as well with him. And with that, I'm looking forward to hearing it. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Matt Steinfeld. I'm the Associate Director of Clinical Training at the Substance Abuse Treatment Unit here at CMHC. My first year in the department was Sid's last full year, and I was the lucky beneficiary of all of the qualities that Kay just mentioned. So it's an honor to get to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Drew Westen. Dr. Westen received his BA at Harvard, an MA in Social and Political Thought from the University of Sussex, England, and his PhD in Clinical Psychology at the University of Michigan. He taught at Michigan following his doctorate, then at Harvard Medical School, where he was chief psychologist at Cambridge Hospital and associate professor, before moving to Emory University, where he has since served as professor in the departments of psychology and psychiatry. Dr. Westen is an active clinician, researcher, and political consultant with more than 150 scholarly publications and several books whose titles include Self and Society, Narcissism, Collectivism, and the Development of Morals, which I'm told he wrote at age 25, and his best-selling book, The Political Brain, The Role of Emotion in Deciding the Fate of a Nation, the Fate of the Nation, whose title is perhaps even more timely than when it was published in 2007. This work in particular has had wide-ranging influence on elections internationally. He's advised a range of candidates and organizations, from presidential campaigns to the U.S. House and Senate caucuses, and has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, among other publications. His major areas of research involve understanding personality disorders, adolescent psychopathology, political psychology, psychotherapy effectiveness, how to integrate case formulation and diagnosis, and the interface of psychodynamics and clinical science. His assessment measure, the SWAP, the Shedler-Weston Assessment of Personality, informs the evidence base of the second edition of the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, the PDM-2. He is a wide-ranging, integrative, and creative theoretician who has made contributions to our fields in helping us make links from the neuron to the nation-state, from the individual body to the body politic, and therein consider who we are as members of local and national communities as we might be to one another. This morning, he will be presenting a lecture entitled Thinking Clinically About Political Discourse, Neural Networks, Narratives, and Emotions. It's my honor to echo what Jack and Kay have said and welcome Dr. Drew Westen to the department.
Can you all hear me okay? Great. Well, first, it could not be more of an honor to be here speaking, doing this lectureship in honor of Sid. I'll just say a couple of words about that. I haven't thought them through. I thought, it'd be best to just do this, just to say a few words about him. I first met him when I was a graduate student at Michigan, and he was coming through and giving a talk. At dinner last night, I heard from some people who were mentored by him and who spoke about what it was like to be his student. And I actually felt some of that as a graduate student, which was really interesting, at a different university. When he came and he was talking to our lab, our research group, and he was listening to what we were doing and giving suggestions and advice, and he gave this feeling of having his arms around you in this very, very big way. Just as a slightly less personal example about Sid, just for those of you who didn't know him well or don't know much about his legacy, first of all, it's amazing to hear that there have been over 2,000 references to his work even after his death, because in academia, once you stop reviewing articles, people stop citing you. So that is quite a tribute in itself. I wish I were kidding, but I'm really not. But that's why I'm hoping to make it a few more years. But when I think about the impact of his work, is that it was in so many areas. I did not know that he was a political junkie, and I just learned that he was a good lefty. But what he did and what probably influenced me the most was there had been so much theory in about object relations, and to be more just colloquial about it, about how we represent ourselves and others in our minds. And what he did was to essentially pioneer this idea that, we don't just have to talk about this. We can actually study it. We can measure it. We can see what it correlates. We can see how it changes with treatment. We can see what kind of treatment it does change. And he started out with Rorschach measures and moved gradually to more and more narrative measures. All of that was Sid's unique legacy to the field of taking the kind of detailed clinical thinking that the people in this room I know is central to the way you work therapeutically, and to be able to measure that and to merge science and practice in a way that really very few people had been able to do, and that he did so well. So I just wanted to say that if there's you can certainly trace my intellectual legacy to Sid in that way, because much of my career has been spent before I moved into politics, which you'll be hearing about. But much of my career has been spent at that point of thinking about how do we merge the interests and needs of clinicians with the interests and needs of research, and of the kind of research that our patients need. And how do we make clinical case formulation useful? And the kind of clinical case formulation not only useful, but empirically testable, and to have what we learn empirically come back and inform the way we understand our patients. And that's something that Sid did that is a contribution that will last well beyond even these 5 years and 2,000 citations, which is really extraordinary. I will say one more personal thing before I start, and that is, I've been here, I've been to Yale in the psychiatry department a few times. I have not been in this room, in this building. It reminds me so much of Cambridge Hospital, where I was the chief psychologist for 10 years. And just to give a quick personal anecdote, the first time I came to Yale was to interview 30 years ago for the chief psychologist position at YPI, Yale Psychiatric Institute. And at the time, I was kind of on the young side. I was joking with Matthew. I said, "What are you, about late 20s?" I said, how have you done everything you've done at that age? And he said, "You're off by 10 years." When I interviewed, I was 10 years younger than Matthew. And when I walked in, the people who interviewed me took one look at me and thought, "Son, where's your dad?" And it was so obvious from their faces. Afterwards, a year later, I get a similar call from Cambridge Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and they said, "Well, we're interested in having you come out and give a grand rounds, a job talk, and for this position as director of psychology." I said, "Well, I will let you know that wouldn't be my first rodeo doing this. I did this last year at Yale, and I said, 'You should know that I look very young.'" And she said, "Actually, I know that you are very young, because," she said, "we counted back from your CV about how old you must be, and yes, you're younger than the average age of our interns, but we're still interviewing you." I said, "All right." And the day I gave my job talk there, I was telling Matthew before, you know how when you're a speaker, sometimes you're on and sometimes you're off. And I don't know which it's going to be today. Hope I'm on. But that day I was on, and they were looking for someone who could think clinically but also do research, and very much in Sid's in Sid's kind of model. And at the end of the job talk, one of the in the grand rounds, one of the people who was making the decision says, she was asking a question, then she just blurted out, "But you're so young." And it is one of the only times that I can remember ever saying exactly what you would think a day later. "Oh, I wish I'd said that," which was I said, I said, well, I'll tell you, I have many flaws, but this is one I promise I'll grow out of. So, with that, I'm going to take a different kind of turn with the presentation today. I've been asked to speak about politics and about, because in 2007, I wrote a book, The Political Brain, that Matt mentioned, that I had no idea. It came from having, oh, by the way, this will be a nonpartisan presentation. I happen to be a partisan. I will tell you, I do work for primarily nonprofits left of center and speak to the House and Senate Democratic caucuses rather than Republican. If the Republicans supported something that I agreed with, I would work with them on something. I haven't seen that yet, but if it does happen, I would do it. I'd love to see I actually have done some bipartisan work for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, for example, with Republican pollsters and stuff. So, that said, what got me to write the book was watching John Kerry blow up an election that he could easily have won. And at that time, I was a commentator for All Things Considered, and I kept trying to get them to take a piece on the lack of emotional intelligence of the Kerry campaign. And they would not take it, and finally my editor fired me and said, I'm tired of hearing about this. And then came the Swift boat attacks, which, if any of you remember, occurred. He responded the most emotionally unintelligent possible way, which was to say nothing when someone attacked his honor. And he dropped 18 points in the polls afterwards. And it was exactly what you would predict. And I thought, damn it, I'm going to write a book on how you would talk to voters if you actually knew something about how our minds and brains work. And in the meantime, my colleagues and I did an fMRI study on the brains of partisans and how they process information that conflicted with what they wanted to believe about their candidate. It's actually during the Kerry Bush election in the weeks approaching it. And what we found was, just in a nutshell, was that, we gave people a reasoning task, which was for, say, Kerry. They're lying in the scanner and they're hearing and reading the following. First, a slide comes up that says, in 1996, John Kerry said on Meet the Press, we have to keep all of our options open on Social Security. That means means testing. That means, because we have a generational responsibility to make sure that this solve it. Good, right? The next slide comes up. In this year, 2004, John Kerry was on Meet the Press, and he said, we would never consider things like means testing for Social Security. And he goes on, and then he says, we have a generational responsibility to protect our seniors. All right, so here I am, a Democrat, reading this, and obviously, when the next slide comes up and says, consider Mr. Kerry's words and actions are inconsistent. You have to rate it on a 4-point scale of how true that statement is. Well, obviously that statement is true. But if you're a partisan, as an election is approaching, you do not want to believe that statement is true. And it turned out the Democrats and Republicans looked exactly like each other, except that on the Kerry tasks, the Democrats could see that they were reasoning appropriately. On the Republican task, about George W. Bush, the Democrats could reason. About Kerry, the Republicans could reason. About their own candidates, we saw no activation whatsoever in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, where you would expect to see, where every reasoning task ever tested has shown activation. We saw no hippocampal activation. What we saw was activation in a number of circuits. Back then, we were looking for places in the brain, but we're thinking in terms of circuits that involved, in particular, negative affect, as well as a lot of activity in the anterior cingulate, suggesting trying to regulate some kind of, understand this conflict between this information, because the ACC, among other things, is involved in conflict monitoring, as well as a lot of activation up here, which we suspected was was involved in unconscious affect regulation. The research that's been done on affect regulation with fMRI has all been done on conscious affect regulation, and it shows dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We suspected that was not going to turn on, and it didn't. What was fascinating, though, is that, so after 20 seconds, when people had rationalized it away, and the Democrats had all found no contradiction for Kerry, the Republican, and this was with 6 tasks each, and then we had Tom Hanks was, I think, the control. Everyone was fine with. They could reason just fine about Tom Hanks. But the fascinating thing was after these activations then all just disappeared, and 20 seconds later, what you see is a burst of dopaminergic activity, particularly in the ventral striatum and other areas involved in circuits for reward. So essentially, if you defended against reality and it worked for you, you got rewarded for it, which is what reinforces defense. But it also reinforces partisan reasoning, which is a real concern. So anyway, when I wrote this book, I had no idea whether I was a fraud, and I had no idea whether I was perceived that way. And instead, what ended up happening was I started getting calls from presidential campaigns and who they hadn't figured out yet that I was a fraud. And over the last decade or so since then, I've done. This is something I learned from Sid as well. That that you can think you know whatever you think you know, but you ought to test it because you might not. And so I insisted all the way through when people would ask me if I consulted. I always said, well, I'll consult on this project, but only if at first I was working with pollsters to do the empirical work, and then I had a really gifted programmer develop a web program for me, so I could collect data from a stratified random sample of 1,000 registered voters at a time, and be able to get a pulse on the country testing messages, but at the same time doing online dial testing, where you've probably seen on television, you've seen on speeches, presidential speeches and debates, the dials go up and down as the person, if you watch CNN and this little red thing on the bottom. Well, that's what we were doing that, but with 1,000 people who could log on at any point in the web, listen to a series of messages, and as they're listening, they're moving their cursor this way if they find what they're hearing compelling, and this way if they don't. And what I see is a readout like this that I can then push a button and stratify by whatever groups I want. I can learn how men and women are responding, how Democrats are responding, Republicans are responding. And that's what a good bit of what you're about to hear is based on. So the one last thing I'll say by way of this horribly long introduction that I hope will be useful in giving you some context is that what I'm about to describe is essentially kind of like doing psychotherapy with 30 million people at a time. The task is to figure out how do you thread the needle to talk about something that may be uncomfortable, or they may be you're usually talking to swing voters or people you want to get out to vote. And the question is, how do you speak with them in a way when they're essentially hearing with a left ear and a right ear, and they've heard these conflicting things? On the one hand, life begins at conception. On the other hand, a woman's right to choose. Well, how do you figure out a way to talk to them about it so that they can actually hear what it is that you want to say? And again, just as a caveat, I am speaking from someone who does work on the left, so if you're from the right, just flip around everything I say, the same principles apply. So, but in a way, what I'm describing is reverse engineering what we do in clinical work. And that is, in clinical work, we're listening for things like, where do you hear affect? Or where do you see something in a narrative that's a blip, where you can see that there's an intrusion of something affective or something that is preventing the person from continuing to tell a coherent narrative the way they were. And you often go back and you say, wait a second, I'm having trouble understanding how first this happened, then what happened? Or you hear a syntactic change. You hear a peculiar word choice, something like that. Well, this is reverse engineering that. This is instead saying, all right, suppose you want to speak to people in a way that is maximally effective. how would you do that using the same kind of clinical skills and the same kind of clinical knowledge? And that's what I'll be getting into today. Last thing I will say, because it raises this issue, is the question is this propaganda? Is this manipulation? Well, I guess you could ask the same question about psychotherapy. You know, if your goal, and what I always say to clients is, first thing off is, there are two things that I will not do. One is, I won't work for any cause that I don't believe in, that doesn't fit my values. That's just, you know, I'm just not value neutral in the way I work. But the second is, I will never lie about anything. The only information that I will ever use is true. And the issue, the mistake that people on the left make, and I've learned that they make all over the world, this is absolutely invariant from South Korea to New Zealand to Germany to Ireland to Brazil. You see this everywhere where there's a left and there's a right and a democratic form of government. Is that Democrats, well, people on the left have difficulty understanding that the extent to which something is emotionally compelling is orthogonal to the extent to which it's true. And by that I mean that you've got these two axes. One is how true is it, and the other is how emotionally compelling is it. Well, you could tell a lie in an emotionally compelling way. I think we all have lots of examples of that from recent politics. Okay, and that's usually called demagoguery. But you can tell the truth in a really boring way and list your 10-point plans, and you'll lose, but you will have told the truth. And we've seen that. We saw that in the last election. Or you can tell the truth. Well, actually, I take that back with a little help from the Russians and 3 million voters who didn't get counted and James Comey. But putting that all aside. But you can say the same thing in a way that is phenomenally boring to people, or you can say something that's true to people in a way that makes them feel something and makes them feel what you do. There's absolutely nothing manipulative about that. That's about good persuasion. I mean, what we do with our patients all the time is to try to help them resolve ambivalence or to try to see something in a way that they didn't quite see it before. Is that manipulation? Well, if your goal is to be helpful to them, no, it's not. And if you're following your values, your goal is not to try to be unhelpful to people. And anyway, or it's not mine anyway. I was just going to say that, so there's a progressive fallacy that somehow if you speak the truth, you can't do it. You can't also use emotion. And I don't know about you, but I don't remember Martin Luther King's "I have a plan" speech. But I do remember "I have a dream." And with that, let me get started. So we're going to focus, first I just wanted to show you this brand new model we've developed at Emory, from the brain to the ballot box, and that we're really excited about. That starts out with a couple of candidates, and then it goes to the brains of voters, and then it goes to they then have to cast their votes, and then the information gets sent over to Russia, and then Putin has to decide whether it's acceptable to him, and then we get an American president. All right, so I just thought I'd present that. It's a really exciting model, I think, and all I have to say is there's no collusion, no collusion. Okay, so with that start, I'm going to talk about 3 principles of effective messaging. And these apply, I'm going to apply them in politics, although they apply in clinical work, they apply in marketing. The scary thing is that the same brain that chooses shampoo also chooses the president. The only difference is that in the United States, and they do it in remarkably similar ways, the only difference is the United States, the shampoo gets a little more attention. But so in terms of 3 principles, the first one that I'm going to talk about is know what networks you're activating. Second is, if you don't feel it, don't use it. And the third is, tell a coherent story or narrative. So let me start with know what networks you're activating, and I'm going to begin with an experiment. You are all the subjects, so thank you very much for filling out your imaginary consent forms. What I'd like you to do is to memorize the following pairs of words. Okay, you ready? Okay. Ocean, moon, projector, table, glasses, floor. Okay, do you have those? Okay. Now what I want you to do, when I raise my hand, I want you just to shout out the name. You really have to do this. Please do just yell it out. Use your words. Just shout out your name. Shout out the name of the first vegetable that comes to your mind when my hand goes up. Okay, you ready? Okay, we've got a few celery fans that other than that don't have much of a consensus here. I often use this to make sure if I'm speaking to a political audience that we really do have a progressive audience. They have completely different ideas about everything. Okay, so now when I raise my hand, but wait till my hand goes up, I want you to shout the name of the first laundry detergent that comes to your mind. Okay, you ready? Tide. How interesting. How many of you said Tide? How many of you said something else? Okay, we have a neurologist outside the room for after the talk. In anywhere from a boardroom of 8 people to a room with 3,000 people, I can get somewhere between 85 and 100% of people typically to say Tide. Now, the market share of Tide is a little over 40%. So I should really be working for Procter & Gamble. I can tell you I'd be making a lot more money than my Emory salary. So somehow we've gone from a little over 40%, which is the market share, to over 80% of you are thinking of it. And if we had time to do a little focus group around the room, I would do one. In fact, who said Tide? How about the lady in the purple over here? Why'd you say Tide? Came to my mind. All right. How about you next to her?
Same reason, but I think I had a visual of it too.
Would you picture that orange? Okay. Yeah. A couple days ago, I did this for potential undergrads coming to Emory, and they all said, "Well, it's about eating Tide pods." That's what came to all their minds. In fact, so when I ask you a question like that, you say, I don't know. I think people often say, I think my mom used that when I was a kid, or maybe that's what I use, or just popped into my head, or I could picture the orange container, or I could picture the way it looked. Well, in fact, I actually did something which primed you to say Tide, and that is that I began the first word pair was ocean moon. And when I said ocean moon, I activated a network of associations around Tide, but that includes Tide. But by saying ocean and moon, what happened is that these are all, I never said waves or tide, but they were now at a higher state of latent activation in your brain, those representations. So when I then said, oh, and by the way, I don't think I need to explain to this group what a network of associations is, but I will anyway. It's an interconnected set of thoughts and feelings and images, memories, values, emotions, that if you activate part of it, you activate the rest of it. Well, when I then said laundry detergents, activated all, fab, cheer, Tide. And you'll notice that there's only one node on these two networks that's doubly activated unconsciously, and that is Tide. And so that came to consciousness. Now, why does this matter? It makes all the difference in the world. The last time, if you want to know how to create networks of association in politics, ask conservatives. Because in 1964, when Barry Goldwater lost, they decided that's when you saw the rise of the American Heritage Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, et cetera, and the conservative think tanks. That was also, they had this messenger who gave this 30-minute infomercial, who was just an unbelievable messenger for Goldwater, even though they knew he was going to lose. He was this fellow named Ronald Reagan. And they said, this is the guy who's going to do it, but we've got to be able to talk conservative to people so people will understand us and get what we feel. And I don't know how many of you were around and remember the years before Ronald Reagan got elected president, but he was seen as a joke. I mean, he was not. I mean, he was so far off the right side of the political spectrum at that point that you could see Russia from his porch. So, what conservatives did was they put literally billions of dollars into messaging research. And they brought in, you will never see a Republican candidate for even state rep who has not had training at Heritage, American Enterprise, Cato, at one of these institutes, and typically has not had substantial training. They catch them early in the college young Republicans. The young Republicans, unlike the young Democrats, are actually funded by the Republicans. They are well funded by the Republicans. They look for orators, for students who speak well. They do the same thing with the Federalist Society at the level of law school. They pick people out. They bring them into Heritage for a summer. They then get them placed at the Wall Street Journal, and they get their career started. And they all know how to speak right from the time they're just little pups in politics. You see a Democrat on television for the first time, they've never had any training whatsoever. And here's just a remarkable thing, that when Democrats name a bill, we've heard, how many of you have heard of H.R. 1? Any idea what the hell H.R. 1 is? I mean, I don't know. Yeah, tell us what H.R. 1 is. Yes, it's about election reform. One of the things that drives me absolutely nuts, they often call it campaign finance reform, is that back in 2010, all the major groups that were working on this came together and actually pooled their funds and had Larry Lessig, who's a Harvard law professor who figured out an absolutely superb solution to Citizens United. And they had him leading the policy side and me leading the messaging side. And we tested ways of speaking with the public about it that won 85 to 15. I mean, and they won with Republicans, Democrats, everybody across the center. Among other things, we learned that you do not call it campaign finance reform, you call it fair elections. It has a completely different meaning because you're activating different associations, and we'll get there in a second. So where I'm about to go with this is liberal. This used to be the central term that Democrats used to refer to themselves, right? They were liberals. It was a term that actually George Washington used to refer to himself. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, they all called themselves liberals. If you want to know when anyone want to take a stab at who the last Democrat was who ran for president of the United States and won, who called himself or herself a liberal? Actually, I'll go ahead and tell you. It was that pointy-headed New England intellectual, Lyndon Baines Johnson. 55 years ago is the last time someone could call himself a liberal and get elected president of the United States. The reason for that is because conservatives spent billions of dollars branding this concept. And by branding, I mean establishing a network of associations to it. And when you think about Democrat, well, I'll give you that example in a second. So you've got liberal elite, you've got tax and spend, you've got liberal special interests, you got big government, you've got deficit spending, you've got weak on national defense, you got all this kind of stuff that's some of the first things that come out of people's mouths. Even Democrats, when you say, well, what are the first things that pop into your head when I ask you, when you think of a Democrat or a liberal? They come up with these things. Let's go ahead and flesh out the rest of the network. You've got Volvo driving, sushi eating, latte drinking, godless atheists. Now, you're all looking at this and you're probably thinking, yeah, I'd vote for that. And that's why the president and the Republicans in Congress raised taxes in this neck of the woods, raised property taxes by cutting that deduction for people whose houses are more, who have more money in their houses. But anyway, it cost me a bunch every month now. Every blue area in the country actually got hit. Every blue city in the country got hit. That was a brilliant move. Incredibly unethical, but a brilliant move. But anyway, you're looking at this and you're thinking, that looks great. Well, this is the most common question I get asked by Democrats in swing states and swing districts, and especially in the South, is what do I do when my opponent says, he's a liberal? Because that's the most potent attack you can make in the South on somebody. And what I often tell them, so I'll let you know a little secret now. Now, this is not something that I would say myself because I'm Jewish, and so it would be disingenuous. This again speaks to, and I'll always say to them, are you comfortable using references from Shakespeare? They say, sure. Say, you comfortable using references from the Bible? And most of them say, sure, if they're relevant and if they're not pandering and and I don't feel like it's a violation of church and state, And actually, every 10th word in Shakespeare's from the Bible. But anyway, so if they say, yeah, I'm comfortable and I'm Christian, and they'll say, oh, all right, well, here's how you respond. Say something like this. You say, when I was in Sunday school, heard many times, and I've heard my pastor speak about it many times in church since, the parable where Jesus said that if you got 2 coats and your brother has none, give your brother one of your coats. Well, that's what I learned, and that's what I believe. Those are my values. Now, my opponent over here is Republican. He's conservative. He believes if you got 2 coats and your brother has none, take his pants. And that's the difference between a liberal and a conservative. So if that makes me a liberal, side with me and Jesus. Anyway, so here are some examples where it really, really does matter. Medicaid recipients. Every time I hear Democrats use that phrase, I want to strangle them. Because, first of all, there are multiple problems with it. One of them is it's passive. A recipient, let me ask you a question. When I say recipient, what's the first word that pops into your head? Free association here. I'm sorry? Charity, handout, free, entitled, right? That's what you think of. Are any of you, if you picture visually someone who's a recipient, do you see anything visually the way you picture their gestures? Is there a gesture that comes to this? Please give me. Does not suggest that you've been paying taxes for Medicaid for a lot of years, does it? It suggests that you're asking for a handout. Every time you say Medicaid recipient, you are activating unconsciously a network about asking for handouts that you don't deserve. Every time you say recipient, you are saying basically this is a person who isn't doing anything, who needs to receive, as opposed to this may be someone who paid taxes for a lot of years who lost their job. Or I'll give you an example that will strike you, be surprising to you. But before I do that, I'll just mention the third thing is, how many of you pictured a person of color? What? Okay, you don't have to answer that out loud. Most people picture a person of color. When you do that, you are activating unconscious stereotypes, unconscious prejudice in most white Americans. And when you do that, obviously, that's not a network you want to activate. In fact, putting aside the White House in Charlottesville, most white Americans today do not wake up and look in the mirror and say, I'm a racist and I'm proud. Most white Americans today would shudder to think, if they knew what's knocking around unconsciously in their own heads about race, they would feel really bad about themselves. I can tell you I've actually tested it and tested people's unconscious responses to learning about their own implicit or unconscious prejudice. But the point is that our better angels on race are conscious, are our conscious values. Most of us do not want racist policies enacted. But unconsciously, I grew up in the South. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I heard the N-word. No, think about the number of times if I don't know why anyone watches the evening news, but if you watch the evening news, all you see is, aside from some place blew up, there was a gas main that blew up in this apartment complex or whatever. But other than that, you see young black men hauled off in handcuffs like this over and over and over again. Well, those associations build, and they create networks of association that get activated unconsciously. Let me tell you, so the first thing you want to do is you want to talk about people who rely on Medicaid for their health care. You see the difference you get between, just in feeling, between people who rely on Medicaid for their health care. When you say, as soon as you say Medicaid recipients, or you say the unemployed, you are turning people with pain-lined faces into nameless, faceless abstractions. You want to do the exact opposite if you care about Medicaid recipients or quote-unquote the unemployed. And so as soon as you say people who, you activate a completely different set of networks. Now, when I'm speaking about networks, I've been speaking metaphorically. Now I'm actually speaking non-metaphorically, is you're actually activating different networks in the brain in terms of different circuitry in the brain, because as soon as you say people who, you're activating the frontal pole, you're activating circuits that evolved over time to process information and feeling about people and about empathy towards people. Versus when you say Medicaid recipients, that is not what you are doing. Here's an example that might strike you, as to get back to this issue about our better angels being our conscious values on race. I want to give you an example of the beginning of a message that can beat any anti-Medicaid message by 20 points. Okay, all the message testing that I've done, by the way, we always test it against what the other side's actually saying. We take the greatest hits from the other side and put it together into the toughest message to beat, because I don't want to be able to show that I can beat something that I deliberately set up to beat. I want to be able to test it, and if I can't, it took us 4 rounds with immigration, and now we have a message that I may get around to showing if I can, that wins across the board. It wins Trump voters as strongly as it wins people on the far left. It is what what the American people actually want. And it was a lesson to me about how sometimes good messaging teaches you about good policy. But here's the beginning of a message that wins by 20 points. You know, if you have a parent or grandparent who is in a nursing home, the chances are that they're probably getting their care through Medicaid. That statement is true, about 60%. That wins by 20%, 20 points. You can't beat it. But let me give you a message that wins by 30 points, okay? Same message, but you're about to hear a different preface to it, and that is this. Whether you're white, black, or brown, if you've got a parent or grandparent who's in a nursing home, chances are that Medicaid's taking care of their health care. That wins by 30 points. And it is simply by prefacing, and by the way, I've tested white, black, brown, white, African American, Latino American, et cetera, and with the particular groups, it makes no difference. But the point of it is that by starting out diffusing the unconscious network, you now allow people to hear the message even more easily, because now they're not thinking underprivileged, poor, not me, poor, other color than me. Those white swing voters are no longer doing that now. You've prefaced it from the start. You've primed them in a way that gets them to think a different way. The unemployed, great example. When I say the unemployed, how many of you feel something? It's really hard. It's like I feel a little twinge somewhere of empathy when I hear the unemployed. But the unemployed, again, you're talking all dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Well, it's a lot of steps to get from there to emotion circuitry in the brain. You know, and it doesn't exactly. It's not going to. When you say the unemployed, it doesn't elicit empathy very easily. Once again, think about instead people who've lost their jobs, or people who've lost their jobs through no fault of their own. How many of us between 2008 and 2014 knew somebody who'd lost a job, or had lost a job ourselves, or had a family member lost it? Every one of us. But if you say the unemployed, you otherize a group who you want to be us and not them. And you've essentially created a narrative where it's us against them, but you didn't mean to. But you're doing it unconsciously by doing that. By saying people who, you're creating empathy right from the start. People who've lost their jobs. I had a student the other day tell me that that when I said, I was giving this example, he said, you know, when you said the unemployed, I didn't feel anything and think of anything. When you said people have lost their jobs, I thought of my mother who lost her job a couple weeks ago. Just a couple of weeks ago, she'd lost her jobs and she was not the unemployed to him. So you can see the difference that makes. I'm going to skip through to 47.3 million Americans. Nearly 50 million Americans. Why do you say that? You say that because as soon as you say 47.3 million Americans, you are down in the weeds and people are thinking about it, and they're thinking about, well, when you say 47.3 million Americans, this is from 2008, don't have health care coverage. Well, then you get people thinking, well, does that include them illegals? And I mean, you get them going in all kinds of directions you don't want to get them going. Notice when I said to you before, I said about the market share of Tide is about 40%, a little over 40%. I did not say it is 41.3%. That is in fact accurate. But so is, it's a little above 40%. When I said it's a little above 40%, I could say, yeah, and compare that to the 80 to 85 to 100% that I can get people to say Tide. It is so much easier than if I'd said, the market share of Tide is 41.3%. I'm taking you off the point. Same thing with adjectives, with acronyms, by the way. In politics, you never want to take your acronyms out in public. I mean, they are absolutely deadly. No one knows what they mean half the time. I mean, HR1 is such a good example. It took me a while to remember what HR1 is. When someone mentioned it to me a couple days ago, I spent 6 months working on HR1. It wasn't called HR1 back then, but that was, you know, and that was several years ago. But it's amazing that how useless those things are. I mean, you think about when the last name for HR1 was before campaign finance reform was McCain-Feingold. I mean, doesn't that sound like the beginning of a joke about, well, there's a Jew and an Irishman and I go into a bar, and I mean, that's not meaningful to the average person. People don't know what McCain-Feingold is. Here's a great example. The ACA, the Affordable Care Act, often called by its advocates on television, ACA, or the ACA, or the Affordable Care Act, or the worst of them is Obamacare. Obamacare was a term that was invented, for God's sake, by the right to kill it. They invented it, they did that because what they know is that any president who is really liked by one side will be really hated by the other side. So we might want to honor President Obama for being the one who made the first step towards universal health care in the United States. But it is not a good idea. Think about the feeling that you've had when you've flown into Reagan National Airport. I remember when I first flew into Reagan National after it had been National Airport before that, it took me 10 years to call the damn thing Reagan National. Imagine if most people don't remember who the president was who created and passed Medicare. It was Lyndon Johnson. Now, Johnson's associated with a lot. His domestic policy was absolutely brilliant. Had he not gotten mired in the Vietnam War, he'd be remembered as one of our best presidents, probably after FDR. He did as much to advance the New Deal. People don't know this. I only know this because I was researching the book and accidentally came across it, was that I looked at some census figures. In the 5 years that he was president, with his war on poverty, he cut the poverty rate from 20 to 10% in the United States. Imagine if he had not gotten mired in the Vietnam War, had seen his way out of it, and could have been president for 4 more years, we might not have the blighted inner cities that we have today. We might not have this myth that there's nothing you could do about the poverty, or the fact that the P word is something that's not used in public discourse. You talk about working people, but you don't talk about poor people. People talk about the poor. Again, horrible, horrible thing to do, because again, you're making people abstract. When George Bush was president, I still find this funny that he wanted to be the education president. I mean, one of our most uneducated presidents, who couldn't be bothered to read a briefing paper that says, Bin Laden about to attack United States, wanted to be the education president. All right. Okay, but what did he call his program? His signature legislation was called No Child Left Behind. It's really, really good messaging. The reason it's good messaging is how would you like to be on the other side trying to defend why you're against No Child Left Behind? It's really easy to say, oh, no, you want to leave children behind, really? It's a great way of saying it, and if you remember, if you recall, if you were alive and back then and were politically paying attention, you never heard a Republican use the acronym NCLB, and you never heard George Bush say, and that's why I'm for NCLB. It was always, and that's why I'm for No Child Left Behind. And it's a really powerful phrase. It also has military connotations for those of you who know the background to that, about no man left behind on the battlefield. So the unconscious resonance of that was very, very deep, even if that were not deep itself. What it does is, when you speak at that level, is you force the other side to be down in the weeds explaining why your policy isn't working. I mean, you force them to say, well, the problem is that it's really about testing. The person says, it's not about testing. It's about making sure that all of our kids have access to high-quality American education. It's about not leaving children behind. What about that don't you get? Well, what you want to do is you want to be bombing from 10,000 feet with your values, and you want to let them be down in the weeds. You don't want it to be the other way around. So imagine if we tested this too, and it worked. The Democratic candidates used this in 2007, 2008, in the run-up to the health care reform. We were winning 70-30 on it. And then once President Obama became president, he and his team decided, oh, we don't need to message anymore. We don't need a narrative anymore. And they let the Republicans just take over the narrative. Well, if you let the other side take over the narrative, they're essentially filling in the public's networks of associations. And that's not a really good idea. I'm going to move in a sec. So what we found is that a much more effective thing to say is, instead of saying, I believe in universal health care, means nothing to the average person. If instead you say, I believe in a family doctor for every family. Did you feel something different from that? Well, we found that if you said, I believe in universal health care, and then you said, and by that I mean, and you give 3 principles, we were at 50-50. You start with, I believe in a family doctor for every family. You give exactly the same principles. Experimental test, 1,000 people. You win 70-30. That's the difference that this makes. Now imagine you're on television, and you're defending this bill, which, I mean, this is a remarkable thing that the Democrats managed to pass universal health care and get destroyed in election after election for it. Lose the House, lose the Senate. I have a chapter in a follow-up book that I'm working on now called How to Lose Millions of Votes by Saving Millions of Lives. I mean, only the Democrats could pull that off. Imagine you're on television and you're defending a family doctor for every family. You say, I believe in a family doctor for every family. The other side says, well, this plan is going to do it's socialized medicine. See, wait a minute. Is that what I'm saying? Because I didn't hear those words come from my mouth. I think I talked about making sure that every family has a doctor. Is that something you're against? Now they're now they're going to have to get in the weeds. Now they're going to say something like, even if they're using their talking points, they'll say, well, he wants to put a bureaucrat between you and your doctor. You say, you don't seem to be listening, Congressman, because, first of all, we already have a bureaucrat between you and your doctor, and it's called a health insurance company. And what I'd like to do is to get them out. Sorry, I know I'm in Connecticut. I shouldn't say it. But what about a family doctor for every family? Do you not hear? I want you to be able to have a direct connection with your doctor, your healthcare provider, your nurse practitioner, your nurse. I don't want somebody in between. I want to make it possible for you to have that relationship. Now they are down in the weeds, and you're up at the level of values. And remember, I have a plan versus I have a dream. And that's the difference here. I'm going to skip through. I'm going to have to skip through this. This is the subliminal part of my presentation. Actually, no, I'm not going to skip this. I'm going back and forth. This is ambivalence. This is Americans' ambivalence towards immigrants. These are data that we collected on a large messaging project when a couple of the big Democratic donors funded this in 2008. I'm going to skip this. Never mind. I want to go to the second principle. If you don't feel it, don't use it. There's a reason that the Latin root for emotion and move is the same thing. It's because emotions move us. You know, reason gives us a great roadmap, but it doesn't give us the oomph. It doesn't give us the motivation to move. And I sometimes call this the Ella Fitzgerald Duke Ellington principle. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. If it is emotionally inert, it is going to be politically inert. Let me give you an example of that. This is Al Gore in his inconvenient campaign in 2000. This is from his first debate. This is one of the most painful moments I can recall in politics as someone who cares about a number of things. Al Gore, by the way, has been right on everything. You know, he was trumpeting climate change 30 years before anybody was trumpeting climate change. This was the election where he got accused of inventing the internet, and you'll hear what he does. He's talking about then Governor Bush's Medicare plan.
Under the governor's plan, if you kept the same fee-for-service that you have now under Medicare, your premiums would go up by between 18 and 47%, and that's the study of the congressional plan that he's modeled his proposal on by the Medicare actuaries.
Is your heart thumping? Right. So first of all, the 18 to 47%, you're not going to remember that in 15 minutes. You might now because I've repeated it. So we got a little bit of extra priming. You're not going to remember it tomorrow. I have trouble remembering whether it's 18 to 47 or 70 to 48, and I've watched this about 1,000 times. The appeal to the Medicare actuaries, the average American doesn't know what an actuary is. All right, this is Connecticut. You do. But nobody else does, and they probably wouldn't like one if they did. It's not a great source to appeal to. There's nothing in that message that makes you feel anything about what the governor's doing. Well, I'm going to say exactly what he said, but a different way. Under the governor's plan, if you're using Medicare for your health, your rates are going to go up, your premiums are going to go up by about 1/3. Well, you know, if you're on a fixed income, that's an awful lot of money. And that's just not how we treat our parents and grandparents in this country. And that's the difference between us. I just said exactly what he said. You notice the difference? Thank you. You notice the difference in how that makes you feel and how that would make the average American feel. The point is, in fact, not to dumb down our political messages. It is to increase their emotional intelligence. There is no conflict between reason and emotion in this respect. You want to give people to say reasonable things in emotionally compelling ways. Let me give you Keynesian economics in 15 to 30 seconds, okay? You know, when the private sector is spiraling downwards and it can't hire people, then what you need to do is we need to have the government hire people, because every $100 you put in the back pocket of somebody who's working is $100 that person puts back into the economy and leads to the hiring of the next person, which leads to the hiring of the next person, until you start the private sector kicking in again. Right? Now, I don't know how Keynes would feel about what I just said, but what I just gave to you is the general theory in 30 seconds. But makes sense, doesn't it? You know, $100 in the pocket of every working person is going to lead that person to spend that $100, which is going to help hire the next person. Similarly, here's a simple statement that I can tell you beats anything you can say from the other side. every time a corporate CEO cuts himself a bonus for $3 million, he's just cut the paychecks of 1,000 of his workers by $3,000 apiece. That makes you feel something, doesn't it? Doesn't that make you feel that's really unfair? All that came from was basic math. I just multiplied 1,000 times 3,000, it's 3 million. And it's the truth. I wanted to show you Dukakis, but I can't do that. Or there's also a hilarious cruise ad. If we come back on questions to get to it, that's really fun for you to watch. But I'm going to skip over this too, and finally end with this, and that is tell a coherent story. We are a storytelling species. We evolved about 100,000 years ago, and it was only the last 5,000 years that we've seen literacy. It was not until the end of the 20th century that that there were more literate human beings than illiterate human beings. It will not be until the 21st century that most human beings, in fact, have literacy. So what that means is for 95,000 years, we had to pass along knowledge and values across generations somehow. How do we do it? Well, we did it with stories. And if you think about the major monotheistic religions, the great, the three that emerged over the last 2,000 years, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, how are their holy books written? They're written in parables. Well, if you tell a story, people remember this. This is something that anyone who's ever spoken to a jury understands, is that you have to tell a story. You don't just give people a bunch of evidence and say, hey, let me tell you my evidence. That is the standard democratic way of doing it. Let me tell you my 10-point plan. It's like, I couldn't give a damn about your 10-point plan. Tell me what your values are, because actually values are a much better predictor than this particular issue position that you've got. And we'll get to that in just 1 second. So I'm going to skip over this too. This is, again, more subliminal presentation. So no one wants to hear your fact collection or your laundry list of 10-point plans. One of the things that I did learn empirically by testing about 1 million messages now with about 100,000 Americans is you never want to break 3 on anything. That from doing online dial testing where people are listening to messages moving the dials this way, whether it's 3 examples, whether it's 3 principles, whether it's 3 whatever it is, if you break 3, the dials start to go down. You get to the 4th commandment, the dials start to go down. It's a cognitive processing limit that we have. And if you think about it, if your significant other says to you, hey, honey, could you pick something up at the grocery store? There's 3 things that we need. And you're about to leave work. You're probably not going to need to write that down. Now, start getting a little older, like some of us, you might need to, but most people, you're going to remember 3. As soon as you hit 4, you're likely to either start writing or to get out your phone. And the reason for that is this processing limit. We've all known about 7 plus or minus 2 for years, but this seems to be another processing limit. But it's a cognitive affective processing limit, which is really fascinating, is that the emotions go down after 3. Now, that's not something I knew before. That's something that I've just learned over time. You want to share your values, and the issues will take care of themselves. If you want to see a perfect case control study of that, look at President Obama versus Hillary Clinton and their electoral success or non-success. And that is, they both ran on exactly the same ideas. They were both centrist Democrats. I don't think there was an ounce of daylight between the two of them on virtually anything. But he could speak with soaring rhetoric, and she just would not do it, even though she knew she needed to do it. She had at least 5 nights a week the smartest political consultant in the world lying next to her. So, she had the help, and she knew the data on this, but she just wouldn't do it. And whether she couldn't do it or whether she wouldn't do it, when I was asked by someone fairly early in her campaign about what I would recommend if I were advising the then Secretary Clinton what to do, what would be my most important recommendations? I say, well, most important one is I would have her watch Madam Secretary for 3 hours a day. If you've ever seen Madam Secretary, the show was created by Hollywood for her, to teach her how to run for president. That was the entire purpose of it. I mean, and it turned out to be a great show, but that was its purpose. And if she just watched, there are two axes that we look for in a leader. One is strength, and one is warmth. And if you have one of those but not the other, you might be able to pull it off. And she did strength really well, but she did warmth so poorly. And how many of you remember her campaign slogan? I'm with her. All right. Better together, I think, was another one, something like that. How many of you remember Donald Trump's? Make America Great Again. I mean, it is one of those tells a story. I mean, the story that he just told with that single sentence, with that single tagline, "Make America Great Again." We were once a great power. We once had jobs. We once had good paying jobs. And now, look at us. We're seeing these towns that are just washed out, losing our jobs, and we're going to make America great again. Really simple story. And it's a story that meant something to a lot of people. It didn't mean anything to him, but it did to a lot of other people. So just to wrap up, values are superordinate to issues. If you think about the research in cognitive science, this was all done on straight cognition, but it applies just as much to affect. And that is that we have superordinate categories like bird, and we have subordinate categories like canary, all right, or robin, or finch. Well, values, every story has a moral. Think about the stories you read your kids when they were little. They all had morals. Well, when you start out at, you know what, I'm going to skip over this and just show you a good story. This is, do you want to see an antidote to Trump on immigration, or do you want to see one of the best ads ever produced in American politics? Which one, the antidote to Trump? All right, what you're about to see is, you're going to see 3 lines. This will be 1 minute, and you're going to see this is a message that took us about 4 or 5 years to get to. But I'll tell you in advance what these numbers over here mean. It beat the message that eventually, this was done 3 or 4 years before Trump. It beat the Trump message 61 to 23 with all voters, registered voters, 64 to 23 with swing voters. 84% gave it a 60 or above on a 100-point scale, meaning I really like this message. 62% gave it an 80 or above, which means this is exactly what I believe. That means you've got affective involvement. When you break 40% on above 80, you've got enough affective involvement, you're going to win the issue. So the only other thing I'll tell you about this before you hear this, so this is a message that people heard online, and the 3 lines are not Democrat, Independent, Republican. What I learned over time was, if you do that in message testing, you actually lose out on a lot of information about people who call themselves, for example, moderate Republicans, but are movable on any given issue. And so what I learned is that there's 20% who call themselves strong Democrats, 20% call themselves strong Republicans. I find that everybody in the middle is swing on virtually any issue. So the red line is the 20% strong Republicans. The blue line is the 20% strong Democrats, and the rest is everybody else. What you should expect from a message like this is 3 lines that go like this. So this is a progressive message. It should be blue up here, green here, red here. And now you're going to see what it looks like.
Our immigration laws ought to reflect both our interests and our values as Americans. As Americans, we have the right to decide who lives within our borders, and we can't afford to let unscrupulous employers undercut honest business owners by exploiting cheap labor. But we need to treat this as a problem to be solved, not as an opportunity for politicians to score political points by preying on both our legitimate concerns and our prejudices. We're a nation of laws, but we're also a nation of immigrants. Most of us have parents or grandparents who came to this country, and we know the hardships they faced, from learning the language to dealing with the prejudices of their times. So let's secure our borders, require employers to comply with common sense laws that benefit our country, and expect immigrants who want to stay here to do what people who've come to our shores in search of a better life have always done: obey our laws, learn our language, and pay our taxes while earning the chance to become tax-paying American citizens.
Let me just conclude with I guess I'll conclude with that because I'm getting the message. I better conclude. Thank you very much.